Case of the Proletarian Revolution. The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Bryan Godwin. On March 16th, 1883, we were invited to a confidential meeting at 122 Regent's Park Road in Primrose Hill. The scope of this potential arrangement was something we could not estimate yet, but should soon catch Holmes's interest. We were summoned by a German family of entrepreneurs who had expanded their business from Barmen, Rhine-Preussen to England. We were invited into their office. Sitting across from us was an older man with a long beard, such as philosophers wore them these days. Apparently, he was a salesman for the textile industry. However, I knew him from a different context. To be specific, he was a well-known critic of our current economic system. I encountered his early study on the condition of the working class in England, though only partially available in our language, during my training as a physician. His piece was one of the first to provide a socio-medical approach. Holmes, on the other hand, did not exactly leave the impression that he knew who he was talking to. I noticed that by the way he greeted the man. "You need to know," I said to Holmes, "Mr. Friedrich, or actually Friedrich Engels, is a well-known proponent of so-called scientific socialism. As a theoretician of communism, his work is of great importance far beyond England." Holmes's face stayed blank. He grumbled and acknowledged my explanation with a simple nod. "You are carrying things too far." Mr. Engels began speaking a professional but quite German-sounding English. "It was rather my friend Karl Marx who discovered and has scientifically proven the connections between economy and society, class, struggle, and revolution. In this case, I only played the second violin, and this with all my humility and gratitude. Of course, I had not missed the fact that Mr. Marx had just died in his apartment on Maitland Park Road 2 days ago. Before Holmes could ask, "Who, please?" I quickly assured, "Our sincere condolences to the death of your colleague and friend." "A crime has probably occurred," replied Engels, "but it does not in any way refer to Mr. Marx's immediate demise. He was mostly ill during the time of his exile in London, externally and internally. Cigars, alcohol, and reckless night work, over-exploitation of his own health did their part. It is extremely unfortunate and a severe blow to the working class around the world that Marx's work has ended too early. But by no means, no, his death was not a surprise." "So you're saying that the cause of death does not have to be investigated any further?" I interjected. Mr. Engels shook his head. "Not at all, Dr. Watson," he said. "The stomach, liver, skin, and lungs were affected. Various treatments at health and therapy centers from Carlsbad to Algiers only temporarily relieved the symptoms. In the end, Marx succumbed to bronchitis and pleurisy, as noted in his death certificate." "Well, if that's the case," I replied, "I still don't quite understand what our job will entail. What kind of crime is it that you want us to investigate?" Mr. Engels hesitated for a second while stroking his beard and then answered, "Theft. It is about theft. Even in the past, it was an open secret that Karl Marx consistently lived in financially precarious circumstances, which is why Mr. Engels had to support him from time to time with substantial amounts of money. That is why, at first, I did not understand what item of Marx's possession would be worth stealing. So I said, 'As far as I know, Mr. Engels, Mr. Marx's property was limited to a few goods.' 'Indeed,' Mr. Engels replied and tapped his temple. 'His wealth mostly consisted of his thoughts and knowledge. They were priceless. His work has more value than the royal crown jewels, but that is a poor comparison because even the crown jewels will eventually come down to a price.' Dear Mr. Engels, Holmes interfered, slowly running out of patience, would you finally be kind enough to tell us what was stolen in God's name, or are you telling us that Mr. Marx's brain is now being sold by a fence? Mr. Engels frowned. Forgive me, Mr. Holmes, he said, if I have tantalized you, but I cannot clearly deny your assumption. Just as well as human labor comes a commodity in capitalism, so does the human body itself. It is indeed Karl Marx's entire body that has been stolen. Following this statement was a rare moment where Holmes lost control of his normally a little too well put together demeanor and expressed his astonishment by opening his mouth. Before I broke the silence, I just had to amuse myself about his speechlessness. So, you are trying to say that the body is gone? I asked. Indeed, Mr. Engels confirmed. Apparently, it was stolen from the funeral home overnight. Remarkable, muttered Holmes, who was slowly regaining his usual composure. Who would do something like that, and why? Well, gentlemen, Mr. Engels continued, I am hoping that it will be you two who will find an answer to those questions. Money does not matter, you can set your own fee. You need to know, though, that the funeral at the Highgate Cemetery is scheduled for tomorrow, and guests from all over the continent have already arrived. It would be somewhat unworthy if we had to pay our respects and say goodbye to an empty coffin. And, in this perspective, the retrieval of his body has utmost priority. Of course, I replied. However, if we find the body, it will certainly lead us to the perpetrator anyways. Holmes nodded in confirmation, but still slightly stared in the distance, dreamily. A case of this scale was to his liking, bizarre, mysterious, and presumably complicated. But before you take action, Mr. Engels said emphatically and rose from his chair at the same time, I have an important request. The funeral of Karl Marx and his memory are of immense importance for the proletarian and socialist movement around the world. I would therefore ask you to be as discreet as possible regarding this matter. The press shall not find out anything about this. Certainly, that goes without saying, Holmes confirmed. Mr. Engels even raised his right index finger as if he was giving a warning. One more thing. His daughters, Laura and Eleanor, know nothing of the disappearance of their father's corpse, and it should stay that way. In a very short time, the two of them lost not only their father, but also their mother and eldest sister. They are mentally exhausted and don't need any more agitation. Same applies to Miss Helena Demuth. I see, Holmes answered. Since the body has not disappeared at home, there is no need to question any witnesses. Additionally, all three women are probably not our offender anyways. Ignoring this analytically, undoubtedly correct, but a little inappropriate remark, I quickly turned the course of the conversation towards our starting point of the investigation. We will investigate the funeral home at first, won't we? Mr. Engels nodded, took a business card from my desk and handed it to me. Seelenfried Funeral Services, it read, and an address in the immediate vicinity of Highgate Cemetery was written underneath the card. On our way to Camden, where the monumental cemetery was located on Highgate Hill, Holmes was quiet for a while until he got done sorting out his thoughts. When he finally looked up at me, I impatiently asked him, Well, my dear friend, what do you think of the matter? Obviously, this is not an ordinary kidnapping, he said. Usually, an ordinary kidnapping is aimed at extorting a ransom, but the victim must be alive for that. No, we are not dealing with an attempt at blackmail. Mr. Engels would have already received an appropriate letter. I waited for a few seconds, hoping that Holmes had some less obvious thoughts about the matter, but that did not happen. Involuntarily, I clapped my hands and shouted, Is that it, Holmes? If you want to fool me. Not at all, my dear friend, Holmes interrupted immediately. We just need to exclude the impossible, even if it seems obvious. Yes, if that is the case, I began, still not completely calmed down, then we can probably banish other scenarios, like Mr. Marx being resurrected on the third day as a, so to speak, proletarian messiah, so he can ascend into a heaven that he does not believe in, or just as little as the possibility that he is running through the streets of London as a reanimated Jamaican voodoo zombie. But Holmes did not allow himself to be provoked. "Let's hope so, for his own sake and his surviving daughters," he replied dryly. "And yet someone felt the need to steal the body. In any case, we can state that we are looking for a group of perpetrators. One person alone could only have carried out that crime with considerable difficulty. Since the theft happened at night and had to be done quickly, unnoticed, and well organized, it must have been more than one person." Undoubtedly a point for Holmes, and with that, we had indeed completed a first assessment of the circumstances of the theft. And now we were able to assume that the perpetrators planned everything in detail, which again made it clear that we are probably dealing with professionals, and not with some hasty, impulsive act that was perhaps based only on a macabre joke of the like. Our carriage finally reached the Serenity Funeral Home, which was located at the southern end of Swain's Lane, which was very steep and divided the cemetery in an older west and younger east part, which were only connected by a tunnel. The funeral home was of manageable size. Despite the many funerals taking place daily at the neighboring cemetery, the business is likely to run rather modest. That is why the owner personally received us. There were no other employees. He introduced himself as Jacob Seelenfried, a slightly older Jew from Prague who mainly counted immigrants from every imaginable religion amongst his customers. "What a disaster," he moaned, folding his hands and looking at the sky, in his case more like the room ceiling. "Once in a lifetime I have the luck to bury a famous person. I mean, somebody with a clientele, and you do your best to prepare it nicely for the funeral. Lay it down in a coffin with velvet lining, and then it just disappears, just like that. Such a pity." Apparently, Mr. Seelenfried's inner peace was distraught. The loss, in the literal sense, of a very valuable clientele seemed difficult to overcome. "Mr. Seelenfried," Holmes began, "unfortunately, we have to ask you a few questions regarding the pitiable loss of Karl Marx's clientele." "All right, only if I have to," he replied faithfully. "Can't change it anyways." "Have you ever lost a corpse before?" asked Holmes. A little outraged, the mortician answered, "Excuse me. Never, not in 37 years. Everyone knows that at Seelenfried's you get your rest, your eternal rest. Amen." Holmes nodded sympathetically and started looking around the premises. Apparently, there was no special security measures against burglary. The perpetrators only had to smash the glass window at the entrance, reach through, and open the door from the inside. There were no other doors inside. Hence, Holmes said, "As I see it, you don't protect your business from unauthorized intrusion. There is only a simple lock on the door." Mr. Seelenfried's face remained obscured. "Yes, of course not," he replied. "Who would expect something like this? What kind of mentally deficient fools break into a funeral home and steal a defenseless corpse? That's idiotic." I could not stop but smile. "Actually," I interjected, "we don't necessarily think that this was the work of idiots. We are more thinking about a professional team with a well-considered approach." Mr. Seelenfried looked at me blankly and made a dismissing gesture. "Professional? How?" he asked. "Perhaps an accurate stupidity. It is a human carcass, draped very nicely on my part, of course, but not more than a carcass that they robbed. And what about me? I'm ruined now. Just imagine if words go out there. Corpse lost at Seelenfried. This is not a beneficial advertisement for my business. This is a disaster." It seems that Holmes, too, could not stop but smile for a second. However, right after that, he tried to calm the poor man. "Don't worry," he said in a very businesslike tone. "Your client, Mr. Engels, has no interest in making any of this public. That is why he notified us instead of the police to investigate. And, of course, the press will not find out anything about this either, but you have to help us." Mr. Seelenfried sighed loudly. "How am I supposed to help you?" he asked. "The door was forcefully opened, the clientele is gone. That's it, end of story." We heard an approving murmur, and Mr. Salenfried went to the back room, where several coffins were placed on tables. With a wink, he signaled to us to follow, but then he paused. "Why empty?" he suddenly asked. "Did Mr. Engels not tell you that the coffin is by no means empty?" Holmes frowned, his thinker brow. "What do you mean?" Mr. Salenfried shook his head and said, "Come, see for yourself." He went to one of the coffins, apparently Marx's, and opened the lid, looking at us, scowling. As I said, they were idiots. Approaching the coffin, we saw and were somewhat astonished that the coffin was filled with books. Holmes took one of them and read from the cover, Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, von Karl Marx. He opened the volume, turned one page, and continued, Second edition, Hamburg, 1872. And with that, I also took a book. It was the same German edition of Karl Marx's main work. In total, there were about 50 identical books on the coffin. Mr. Salenfried raised his arms in despair. "What is the point?" he whined. "Can you tell me what this is about?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't," he replied. "Maybe this is just a joke?" I guessed, but I was not quite convinced myself. Consequently, Holmes replied, "Not very likely. For a joke, this seems a little too laborious." Then he turned to Mr. Salenfried. "Thank you for your help. That would be all. Surely you would allow me to take a copy with me, right?" "Only one?" the funeral director said indignantly. "Take them all. What am I supposed to do with them?" Holmes smiled. "Thank you, but one book will suffice. May I ask you to leave the rest in the coffin for the time being?" "You could bet your life on it," Mr. Salenfried said. "I was not about to clean up this nonsense. Plus, the coffin's already been paid for." While Holmes marched towards the exit and said goodbye with a simple nod, I put my copy of The Capital back into the coffin and closed it with help from Mr. Salenfried, who, in the process, suddenly started going back to business. "Dr. Watson," he said, "being a detective is certainly a very dangerous profession. You must deal with all kinds of brutal and heinous criminals. Have you ever thought of making precautions for the cause that, God forbid, you were to die while you were doing your job? I can make you a good offer. Full service, bathing, shaving, grooming, balming, clothes, coffin, funeral with flowers and wreaths. I have the best price in North London." Even though Mr. Salenfried might not have been totally wrong with what he said, I, for my part, was not ready to organize my premature passing. "Thank you for the offer," I replied politely, "but I have no plans to depart from this life. Maybe another time. Have a nice day." I set out to follow Holmes. When I was almost at the door, Mr. Salenfried shouted in my direction, "Think about it. When you're dead, it's too late." The long ride back to Regent's Park Road to Mr. Engels was very one-syllable. Holmes browsed, sometimes hectic, other times absent-minded, through the more than 600 pages of the Capital. Every now and then he uttered a German word aloud, which was probably written in the text. Several times he nodded violently. He shook his head a little less often and laughed twice. Then he suddenly slammed the book closed, looked up at me and proclaimed, "I understand." I was not trying to hide my astonishment. "What exactly do you understand, Holmes?" I asked dutifully. "The relevance, my dear Watson," he said. "This is an extremely astute analysis. If the things written in this book are true, then our current economic and social system does not have any further legitimacy. It is not a surprise that Marx's opponents want to bury this book with its author." I didn't really know what to think of his statement, especially since several questions popped in my head. But out of all those, the one I had to ask was, "Holmes, did you actually just read this whole book during our ride?" "Mostly, yes," replied Holmes. "Obviously, you're not familiar with the technique of diagonal reading. I think I got quite an idea of Mr. Marx's economic ideas. And one thing is certain, this capitalism that he is writing about is arguably the most intelligent and best organized raid in human history. And all of that within the framework of the law. Extremely remarkable. I had to laugh for a moment. Oh, for heaven's sakes, Holmes, I exclaimed. Are you a socialist now? All I got was a sober headshake. There is nothing in it about socialism, Holmes said, putting the book aside. Besides, if this very complex, overly long, and for the common reader difficult to understand piece is the central propaganda of Mr. Marx and Mr. Engels, I feel very pessimistic about this so-called proletarian revolution. Nobody within the working class will ever understand that. I can reassure you, I said, socialist literature, even in trivial, generally comprehensible nature, are 10 a penny these days. I'm sure that Mr. Engels would be happy to give you a more convenient pamphlet. Holmes shook his head. Personally, I have no need for this, since I already understood Mr. Marx. His observations are scientifically correct. I'm only asking myself if this great philosopher also considered that it is one thing to analyze the world and another to completely change it. And that is what it's all about. Before I could refer Holmes to Mr. Engels again, our carriage stopped at its destination. Back in the office of the German manufacturer and communist, Mr. Engels, we were introduced to a guest who had arrived in the meantime. He was of similar age, with a similar beard, a similar glance, and all-over look. "Mr. Holmes, Mr. Watson," said Mr. Engels, "may I introduce you to my long-time friend, Mr. Wilhelm Liebknecht, who is a member of the German Socialist Party." Liebknecht rose from his chair and we shook hands. His English was accent-free since he, as we learned later, had also spent a few years in exile in London. At this time, over 30 years ago, there he also met Mr. Marx and Mr. Engels. Mr. Liebknecht traveled from Leipzig as quick as possible. He is supposed to give a speech representing the German working class tomorrow at the funeral, Mr. Engels explained. "Isn't it a fact," I asked Mr. Liebknecht, "that there currently is an anti-socialist emergency law in the German Reich? How can you even organize your party legally?" "Indeed," Mr. Liebknecht replied, "Bismarck's socialist laws prevent any officially organized political activity. However, my mandate as a member of the parliament is based on my individual candidature. As long as I don't act on behalf of the party, it's formally legal." "You have to know," added Mr. Engels, "Mr. Liebknecht and his comrade, August Bebel, are extremely successful in Germany, despite the state repression. Their commitment is as a role model for the socialist movement around the world." "Nevertheless," continued Mr. Liebknecht, "arrests, expulsions, raids, and prison are the staff of my life. We are under constant surveillance. Bismarck probably sent a couple of watchdogs from the secret police to spy on me here as well. Prussia is everywhere." Holmes, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he said in a firm tone, "time is short. Has Mr. Liebknecht been let in on our problem?" "He has," Mr. Engels confirmed. "We can speak openly." "All right, then I will make a claim on this right away," continued Holmes. "Unfortunately, I have to inform you that this matter has so far been difficult to understand. Even if you consider different angles, the whole thing makes little to no sense." "Well, one thing is clear," replied Mr. Engels. "A missing body indicated a targeted sabotage of a planned funeral. Obviously, his opponents fear Marx even after his death." "Certainly," said Holmes, "the idea suggests itself." "And all sorts of perpetrators could be considered for this," interjected Mr. Liebknecht. "Many would be interested in hindering or preventing this important event from happening. For example, anarchist agitators? But even more diverse state chancelleries. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some continental secret service behind it, like the Russian Okhrana or the German Geheimpolizei." Holmes didn't answer, but started to walk around the room in a circle until he was done collecting his thoughts. Very well, he announced. If the aim was to prevent the funeral, we will put an end to this. Let us carry out the funeral as planned and see what happens. Mr. Holmes, you want to bury an empty coffin? Asked Mr. Liebknecht, surprised. Holmes smiled. Not really. The coffin is by no means empty, he replied, placing his copy of the Capital on the desk. Despite certain concerns from Mr. Engels and Mr. Liebknecht, we decided to go through with our plan. After all, to be honest, we did not have any better options. The next morning, Holmes went to the cemetery, where he met the mourning community, which deliberately consisted of family members and close friends. In addition to the two German socialists, Mr. Marx and Mr. Liebknecht, who knew about the secret, were Marx's daughters Eleanor, with her fiancé, the socialist Edward Aveling, Marx's sons-in-law, Paul Lafargue and Charles Longuet, both from France, his second daughter Laura and housekeeper Helena Demuth, and other friends that accompanied Mr. Marx throughout his life. Meanwhile, my job was to ensure the safe transportation of the coffin to the cemetery when I made the last arrangements with Mr. Seelenfried at his institute. I started feeling a little uneasy because we had never really checked whether there were actually only books in the coffin. What if there was still something on the bottom, and by holding the funeral anyways, we would act exactly as the perpetrators planned? What if we walked into a trap? Mr. Seelenfried was not very happy when I started clearing the coffin book by book. It was only at my explicit, slightly irritated request that he started to help me. And indeed, when the coffin was free from all the books, we found a somewhat unsettling surprise at the bottom, no less than 10 sticks of dynamite. Our previous negligence irritated me, since the explosives that were left in the coffin would certainly serve the following plan. Without the initial spark, however, there was no danger, as I had to assure Mr. Seelenfried several times. One would have to ignite the short detonating cords by hand, for example, with a match, to cause an accordingly slightly delayed explosion. Of course, this would have been impossible with all the books in there, and which is why the actual purpose of this installation puzzled me. This is not a very practical death, said Mr. Seelenfried. When you are torn to pieces by explosives, there is nothing left of you. What will remain to be buried? I tell you, Dr. Watson, deaths like this leave even the best undertakers, and I can add my humble self to those, with an immense challenge. Once, I only had a foot left. Mr. Seelenfried's anecdote was the last thing I could remember. The next thing I felt was a heavy, violent blow to the back of my head. Consequently, I sank to the ground and lost consciousness. When I regained consciousness, it was completely dark around me. I immediately noticed that I was gagged and tied to my arms and legs. My head still hurt a lot. I tried to sit up, but immediately hit a boundary with my forehead. When I rolled to the left and right, I also felt walls on both sides, and then it dawned on me. I was locked up in a coffin. Since I couldn't see anything else, I tried to sharpen my other senses, and I felt an unpleasant bump on the back of the coffin, even though it was lined with fabric. Shortly after, I realized that the bump was actually dynamite sticks, and I was laying in Karl Marx's coffin, and it moved. My memory came back slowly, and I was able to reconstruct the sequence of events that must have happened since I was attacked. The perpetrators must have returned to Mr. Seelenfried's institute to incapacitate us and put me in Mr. Marx's coffin. What must have happened to poor Mr. Seelenfried? They must have handed over the locked coffin disguised as transporters or funeral home employees at the cemetery entrance as agreed. They probably had a little excuse for my apparent absence. Thereupon, the funeral procession must have started, with the coffin certainly placed on a trolley. But then I realized the full scope of the plan. This was supposed to be a bomb attack on the funeral procession. In one fell swoop, the highest authority of the international socialist movement, Mr. Engels, as well as leading figures of German and international social democracy, would have been eliminated. But how would the explosive be detonated below me? Only a smaller explosion on the outside could serve as an immediate initial spark for the dynamite rods. The result would be an inferno that hardly any of the mourners, including Holmes, as I now realized, would survive, and I was just collateral damage. But where would this big explosion take place? My brain was working hard to solve this riddle. It had to be a location where the funeral procession moved close together, but somewhere where an unobserved ignition was possible. And there was only one spot in the cemetery that would suit this undertaking. It was on the way from the main gate to the burial site, on the east side of the train, which had to go through the tunnel under Swain's Lane. At the end of the tunnel, the triggering detonation would take place, sparking the dynamite inside the coffin and consequently exploding. The group directly behind the coffin would not stand a chance, and well, at least I would not be buried alive. The car that my coffin was placed on rolled relentlessly along the bumpy cemetery path. When I noticed that a certain defeatistic indifference was beginning to spread, I realized that I was running out of oxygen. Apparently, Mr. Salenfried's high-quality coffins were even airtight. That was when I mobilized all my strength and pushed with the toes of my tired feet against the coffin lid, once, twice, 3 times. Then I threw myself back and forth, desperately trying to hit the sidewalls, knocked on the cover with my kneecaps, and eventually even with my forehead. And finally, the carriage stopped. I was able to hear voices, following a knock on the outside of the coffin lid. Using the last bit of my strength, I answered with a violent kick. The voices grew louder and more excited. Then the coffin was screwed open. Finally, after another half a minute that felt like an eternity, someone opened the lid. Never have I been so happy to see Holmes's face before. He immediately removed my gag and I was able to breathe again. With Holmes's help, I straightened my torso, turned around and saw that we were no more than 20 yards from the tunnel. It was high time. "Holmes," I gasped, "there are at least 2 assassins at the back of the tunnel." Then I sank back onto the velvet lining of the coffin and lost consciousness again. Anything that happened afterwards I only learned from stories while Mr. Engels arranged for my transport to the hospital. Holmes, Liebknecht, and Marx's 3 sons-in-laws climbed over the walls into the eastern part of the cemetery, so that they would bypass the tunnel and end up surprising any lurking assassins from behind. Given the fact that they were outnumbered and the fact that Holmes had a revolver, the 2 assassins they found did not resist. When they identified themselves as members of the German Geheimpolizei, Mr. Liebknecht did not miss giving them both a little parental slap, with conspiratorial revolutionary greetings to the Emperor and Chancellor in Berlin. It was out of the question that they would be able to deliver them, although Holmes handed both over to the London police. They were swapped out against 2 British secret agents who were found out in Germany and returned to their homeland unscathed. This was common practice in the international espionage business. Karl Marx's remains, however, had never left the funeral home. He was hidden and stored temporarily by the perpetrators inside an unused coffin in the cold cellar of the shop. When Holmes and Mr. Engels recovered the corpse through a clue from the convicted spies, they also found poor Mr. Salenfried, who was stuffed in there while unconscious, inside, an experience that he could have done without. At a later point in time, the spies had the job to bring Mr. Marx's body to Germany, where his brain, in particular, would have been dissected and examined in detail in order to gain insight into human intelligence and the revolutionary mind. Of course, this medical and scientific point of view is total nonsense and could only be thought out in Germany, but luckily this never happened. The funeral was carried out with some delay, but still with all dignity, and this time in the presence of the deceased. It is said that Mr. Engels and Mr. Liebknecht held wonderful funeral speeches, and the public was never informed about the difficult circumstances of the original ceremony. I myself only recovered slowly from the events at the cemetery. The memory of being locked up in a coffin and imminent death were traumatic. For a long time, I was dealing with anxiety, extreme mood swings, and insomnia. Only now that I have been in psychological treatment with Dr. Kutzman, I am able to process the events step by step. And part of this process is me finally putting this case to paper. A few months after the occurrence of the disappearance of Karl Marx's remains, Mr. Friedrich Engels visited us one morning at Baker Street. He inquired about my well-being and thanked us again for our work. "I do really hope," I joked, "that you are not missing another friend again, dead or alive." "Don't worry, Dr. Watson," Mr. Engels replied. "At my age, I outlived most of my friends already. I am merely here to personally present you with our latest, freshly printed book." And then he took a thick book out of his pocket and handed it to Holmes. "It is the third edition of the Capital that I was working on very intensely over the last few weeks," Mr. Engels explained. "It contains a multitude of extensions, additions, and clarifications which would certainly be what Marx would have wanted. Thank you again, Mr. Holmes, for your remarks regarding the second edition. They were very valuable for revision." Holmes nodded modestly. "I have to thank you that I was able to help. Please tell me that you have not included me into the preface." Mr. Engels made a waving gesture. No, he assured Holmes. "As you wished, we did not include you. I was somewhat surprised because Holmes did not inform me about a substantive correspondence with Mr. Engels about the Capital. Currently, by the way," Engels continued, "I am going through Marx's legacy. You ought to know that he planned on writing a second, if not third, volume of Capital, and he left behind a plethora of handwritten material. Nevertheless, I am hoping that I will be able to finish editing the next volume within a year. Would you also take a look at the manuscript before I publish it when the time comes?" "I would be very honored," Holmes confirmed. Mr. Engels sighed. "Thank you. It is so unfortunate that you and Marx were not able to get to know each other personally. You two have similar traits of character, the meticulousness, the overall view of a topic, and the astute conclusions. Marx would have enjoyed your presence, and you certainly would have enjoyed his. Well, let me say goodbye. Mr. Move does not appreciate it when I'm late for lunch." I got up from my chair and reached out to Mr. Engels. "Goodbye." Holmes helped our guest to the door while I looked at the new edition of the Capital. On the third page, Mr. Engels wrote a small thank you that said, "For the brilliant detective Sherlock Holmes and his very brave companion Dr. John Watson, in admiration and friendship, Friedrich Engels." When Holmes returned to the table, I put the book aside and looked at him, asking, "So, do you regret not knowing Mr. Marx?" Holmes gave me a gloomy look. "Not at all," he said. "After all I know about him, Mr. Marx may have been very intelligent, but other than that, he was a notorious know-it-all who loved to correct and outdo his friends, sometimes arrogant, somewhat unworldly and unapproachable." I had to stop myself from laughing at this excellent self-description and just replied, "In fact, Holmes, you certainly would not have gotten along well with such a person. Now to my other question. When did you want to tell me that you have caught interest in the theories of scientific socialism?" Holmes shook his head, took a seat, and began to stuff his pipe. "That is out of the question," Holmes explained. "I only added a few comments. I can assure you, my dear Watson, that I remain an avid supporter of capitalism. I remember you saying that capitalism was one single large raid." I asked Holmes and reminded him of his own words. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Just imagine a socialist utopia as Mr. Marx and Mr. Engels have envisioned it. No social differences, no significant private property, no poverty and no wealth, prosperity for all, no envy, no vice, no exploitation, and no oppression, No banks, no landowners, and no aristocracy. And in the end, not even money in its classical meaning. And all of this would imply that we would have to deal with a massively reduced crime rate. My dear Watson, I assure you that we would be unemployed as detectives in such a world. May we be spared the proletarian revolution throughout our lives. Then he put on his distinctively boyish, mischievous grin and happily ignited his pipe.